Welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Zanai Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and we are live for a MACRI talk. Please welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Lori Flores. Dr. Flores is an Associate Professor of History at Stony Brook University and Director of Stony Brook's Latinx American and Caribbean Studies Center and Program. She teaches and researches modern America, US Latinos, labor, immigration, borderlands, oral history, and food history. Her new book, Awaiting Their Feast, Latinx Food Workers and Activism from World War II to COVID-19, traces how the United States' dual appetite for Latinx food and Latinx food labor evolved from World War II to COVID. She also created a digital history project called the Mexican Restaurants of NYC Story Map, which provides a digital history of how Mexican food spread throughout New York City's boroughs from the 1930s to the present. Dr. Flores is from South Texas, and she earned a bachelor's in history from Yale and a PhD in US history from Stanford. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Flores.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to all of you watching now and those of you who are watching later. I'm so happy to be here. Like Sarah was saying, I'm from South Texas. I'm from Alice. So I don't know if we have anybody listening in from there. Maybe some of my family is tuning in or will be tuning in a couple of minutes. But I'm so happy to be invited to speak for MACRI. It's an institute that I've admired for quite a while. And I think more than ever now, it's so important that we support institutes that bring this kind of knowledge and these kinds of speakers that you see featured here on the YouTube or the Facebook page in the past. I think it's just essential that discussions around Mexican American civil rights keep happening. And I'm really, really happy and honored to be a part of doing that right at the beginning of 2025. So I really appreciate the chance to talk about this new book of mine. It was a long time coming. I researched it for 7 years. And so it's been definitely a labor of love. And academia is slow and publication is slow. And so I knew that when I was trying to find a topic for this book, I needed something that would keep me interested for the long haul. My first book, which you see behind me right here, my cousin made me this cute little framed poster of it. My first book was called Grounds for Dreaming, and it was about the farm worker movement in California. And that was written back in the 20 teens. And so when I was trying to think of a topic for this new work, I knew that I still had much more to say about farm workers because farm worker history is so important and valuable and complex. But I thought to myself, well, how can we make the next book something that's different, something that might be bigger, something that's more ambitious in scope? And by that time, I had moved to the Northeast. I had used to live in California, and then I started teaching in Maine and then New York. So I'm a person who tends to write about the places that I live to try to understand them better. And also, in teaching students on the East Coast, it was very different from teaching students in the Southwest. It wasn't just Mexican American students, but Puerto Rican, Dominican, other Caribbean, Central American, South American students. And so I was learning a lot from them. They were teaching me a lot, and I wanted to write a book that in the future could serve them too. So a book that integrated both the history of Mexican Americans, but fit them into the larger history of Latinos in general in the United States and tried to tell those stories together. So I knew that I still, cared about food workers and the labor that goes behind the food in our society that gets to us every day. So many different types of workers are necessary for our food to get to our grocery stores, to our restaurants, our cafeterias, our dinner tables. And I think we all know that in theory, but to really delve into just how much labor is involved in getting even the simplest thing, simplest food item to us, simplest ingredient. It really is monumental, and it's powered by the hands and the bodies and the hearts of a lot of different people. And a huge contingent of food workers are Latino in this country. And by that, I mean both US born citizens. Um, who identify as Mexican American or other Latino subgroups. And I also mean legal guest workers who are coming from all over the world, a lot from Latin America and the Caribbean, and undocumented workers as well. So it's all these different mixtures and contingents of people that are making up a large part of our food industry and the labor behind it.
Mm.
Book awaiting their fee. I think there are a lot of rights in the world of food for food workers that still have yet to be won. A lot of struggles for labor rights in the food industry are really hard to get. And workers have been fighting for decades, for basic things like a minimum wage or a rest day or sick days, or the ability to feel safe while they're working. And wildfires and COVID and other, modern disasters related to climate and related to pandemics have made it much harder for food workers to feel safe at work. So even the most basic rights that we might think of as should be a given. The book is called Awaiting Their Feast because people are still waiting for some of these basics to be integrated into the way that our food system works. So I think what I'm going to do, and Sarah, you can move to the next slide here, is to kind of show you or sample a little bit from the book in order to give you an idea of the kinds of things that the book talks about. I really wanted to cover, thank you for that. Yes, this is the chapter outline here. Just to give you an idea of the kind of ambitious scope that this book tries to cover. The reason, not only because I live in the Northeast now and teach in the Northeast, but another reason I think the Northeast is so important to consider in the history of Mexican American civil rights and the history of Latino labor and cultural and culinary contributions to the US is that the Northeast is still a region of the United States that is mythologized as very white, or people tend to think that the Northeast is not a place where a lot of Latino people live. And the facts are quite to the contrary. So the Northeast has been a Latino, a Hispanic region of the United States for centuries. First with Spanish immigrants coming from Spain, but also the Caribbean, exiles who in the later 18th and 19th centuries wanted to escape from out under the thumb of Spanish Empire. And so willingly moved to places like New York and Providence and Boston and Philadelphia and Portland, Maine, to build new lives for themselves and political escapes. This has been a place where Cubans, Central Americans, South Americans, Mexicans have made their home over time, ever since the 1600s. And so the Northeast is a place where, contrary to a lot of people's ideas, that, oh, that's not a place where a lot of Latinos live, especially if you think of New Hampshire or Vermont or the far, far reaches of coastal Maine. The reality is that these have been and continue to be big hotspots for Latino populations, both who are passing through seasonally for work, but also people who have made year-round lives, permanent lives, and grew up in the Northeast. So it was very important to me that I learn more myself so that I could teach my students better about the history of their own region. But I also wanted to do the work of helping to educate more people about the Northeast as an interesting place in Latino history, and not to mention that much of the Northeast falls within 100 miles of the northern border with Canada. So our other borderland, the one with Canada, the northern border zone, I think, especially now, is becoming just as important and just as changeable and valuable to examine as our southern border with Mexico, because a lot of the same things when it comes to labor and immigration that are happening at the southern border are now happening at the northern border too. So for those reasons, the Northeast is really, really fascinating. It's very understudied, but I hope what my book can do by, traveling through time from the 1940s to today and traveling through different states. You see here that, of course, New York is featured, Maine, Vermont, the New England coast, places like New Bedford, Massachusetts. COVID, there I talk about really the whole country and what it underwent with COVID and the breaking of some links in the food chain. And other places like Philadelphia, Boston, Nashua, Burlington, Vermont, all of these different places around the Northeast where people might not know a lot about the Latinos who lived there both in the past and still today. So it's very important to me to sort of disrupt the myths around the Northeast and New England, especially, because I think a lot of people still have stuff to learn about this region. So I'm excited that the book was able to cover a lot of ground. It took a lot of time to find a lot of these case studies and to interview people and to create these different chapters that you see here. But what I hope I can do is inspire people who want to delve more into individual cities and individual states to do that after reading this book, which is trying to be an umbrella study of a whole region. One of the big points of the book, I would say, is that no matter where you're talking about, whether it's the Northeast or the Southwest or the Midwest or the Deep South or other regions, is that the United States in general has become a nation that has held this big contradiction within it. And I think one of the fundamental contradictions of our nation is that it's a nation that's become more and more obsessed with Mexican food and food ways over time. Like, this is a cuisine that's more and more beloved each year, it seems, in the United States. And so that is happening on one end with food. And then when it comes to Mexican food labor, on the other hand, and other Latino food laborers in this country, they have become more and more invisible over time. Their rights have become more and more threatened over time. And they have been taken for granted more and more as the decades have gone on, at the same time that the obsession and fascination with the food has gone up. So there's an inverse relationship happening there with how much people praise and embrace the culinary versus how they are not embracing, both with citizens and immigrants, and everybody in between, with more xenophobia, more hostility, more ignorance. Like, this is a very measurable difference that's happening here. And so I really wanted to tackle this contradiction to help us look at it, to help us understand it more, and from a historical viewpoint, figure out when that began. And what I'm trying to argue from a historian's perspective is I think this began around the World War II period and has only gotten more and more pronounced over the decades up until now. So I wanted to sample from chapter 1 and chapter 2 and then chapter 6. So giving you sort of samples of 3 chapters in the book so you can get an idea of how it skips over time and talks about different things. So the next slide, please. Many of you, and I'd be interested to see if anybody in the chat right now does have a relative who participated in the Bracero program. But World War II, I believe that it was kind of the starting point for this inverse relationship between embracing the food and not really embracing the food worker. Because the Bracero program era, which was almost a quarter of a century, was a time where the US got very, very used to contracting foreign labor from Mexico in order to help the agricultural industry and food industry in general. So from 1942 to 1964, the US government extended 4.2 million contracts to men in Mexico to have them work throughout all regions of the United States, particularly in farming, but some also worked on railroads for the first couple of years of the program. And working in all states, these men were contracted from anywhere from 3 to 9 months for the kinds of work that they did in fields. And they had no idea when they were contracted what kind of crops they would be working in, or what state they were being sent to, or who their coworkers would be, or who their employer would be, what their salary would be. A lot of unknowns were built into this program that was still today considered one of the biggest and longest standing guest worker programs in the history of the world. And the US and Mexico binationally negotiated the Bracero program to keep getting extended past World War II. It was only supposed to be a World War II measure, but then was renewed by Congress every few years. So this is a program that lasted 22 years. 4.2 million contracts for men. Women and children were not allowed to come to the United States during these months. Of course, some still did, but just through other ways. But this was um, a program for men to basically become the new soldiers related to food in the United States during the World War II period. And then this program got normalized over time as the way that it was going to be. So I believe it was the Bracero program and also these other guest worker programs you see here listed on the slide. On the East Coast, and in the Midwest, we had the farm placement program negotiated with Puerto Rico that lasted for many decades. And Puerto Rico was an interesting case because these workers are technically citizens, but were treated as guest workers and as foreigners, even though they were technically US citizens. And these workers were also male, also worked in the agricultural industry and in vegetable canning and processing factories. So if you look in your fridge or your freezer and you see stuff from Jolly Green Giant or Bird's Eye or any of these other famous vegetable companies that still exist today, those companies would not have gotten as rich as they did without the guest work of Puerto Ricans on the East Coast. And then we also had the British West Indies Temporary Alien Labor Program, which lasted for only a few years, but you see here all the different places in the Caribbean that these guest workers came from as well. So the US was getting very used to being able to enjoy a bottomless reservoir, it seemed, from Latin America and the Caribbean in order to make our agricultural industry up here move more efficiently, produce more in terms of crops and in terms of product, and make our food prices stay at a certain low level. And this was because these guest workers were not making very much when they were toiling away in fields and factories for the United States, for the mainland. So I think it was during this time, the 1940s, and then going on into mid-century and then the late 20th and early 21st century, that the United States developed this dual appetite for Latin American and Caribbean and Latino food labor. And then at the same time, this is around the period where more Americans are going to Mexico as tourists. They're eating the food, and people in the Southwest were already eating Tex-Mex. And so the appetite for the food ways of Latino people, and specifically Mexican food, Mexican and Tex-Mex food, this was becoming more and more of a fetishized cuisine. So it's really interesting that if we look at the conditions of guest workers, and the next slide, I believe, is a picture. Oh, can we move one more first? Yeah. So this is a picture of some guest workers from Puerto Rico eating in their mess hall. So these guest workers lived in employer-provided housing, which were basically labor camps, very scantily furnished, quite uncomfortable, not so hygienic. But in a lot of these camps, they had mess halls and were provided with certain food. And it's so ironic given what you see here as a sample menu for that was served to a lot of Latino guest workers in the United States. So if you pay attention here, if you look at what was served on the weekday menu, and numbers 1 through 5 are Monday through Friday, one thing that you'll definitely notice is that ingredients get repeated, repeated, repeated. And these are all simple carbs, boiled potatoes every single day. Bread, meaning white bread, with only tortillas a little bit of the time, not every day. But the same sort of bread, milk, coffee, bread, milk, coffee, bread, milk, coffee, and potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. Some sort of meat that alternated between different parts of the animal. Sometimes it was the offal, and sometimes it was the part of the animal with a little bit more protein. But in total, if you look at this menu here, except for the tortillas, there's very little gesture towards serving these guest workers who had this Mexican and Puerto Rican ancestry food that might have made them feel more comfortable, more nourished, that might have fed their nostalgia for home while they were working for months or some even years in the United States if they got renewed contracts. There's very little here that is making a gesture towards culturally familiar food or food that these guest workers wanted. And so the previous slide is actually a quote from a letter that some Mexican guest workers sent to the United States government, arguing that the food that they were being given was not only producing a lot of dissatisfaction in terms of portion size and nutrition, but it also wasn't the food that they wanted to remind them of home, to feel comforted in a new place, to feel like they were being nourished both calorically and culturally. So this is an excerpt from a letter that a group of braceros wrote, which was sent to Washington, D.C. And they were talking about the quality of the food in their mess hall that was served to them that they had to pay for. They were forced to pay for this food through their labor contracts. So they said here, our dissatisfaction is not only with the manner in which this food is prepared, but its poor quality and scarcity. There have been times when we have refused to eat the food at lunch and returned to supper where we have been served exactly the same food that we left behind. And the letter was both in Spanish and English. I included one Spanish sentence here that concluded the letter con un trabajo tan duro como el nuestro, necesitamos alimentarnos. De lo contrario, no podemos trabajar con buena voluntad. With a job as hard as ours, we need to feed ourselves. We need to be fed. Otherwise, we cannot work with goodwill. Like, we cannot work well if we don't have food that nourishes us, that tastes good, that's enough portion size. I mean, they're doing really hard labor. And many, many letters like this, many complaints like this were sent to both state governments and also the federal government. And so it shows that guest workers really cared about the food that they got served. Like, it wasn't a little thing to them, it was actually a big, big deal. And so circling back to what I was saying earlier, it's really ironic that in mainstream American culture, um, in grocery stores, in fast food restaurants, this is the era, the 1950s, 1960s, where we start seeing Mexican food in TV dinners, Mexican food in fast food chains. Taco Bell gets founded in the early 1960s. El Torito, other Mexican restaurants in Los Angeles were founded even before the 60s. Like, this is ironically a time where mainstream American diners are able to enjoy Mexican food. And yet it's so sad that the guest workers from places in Latin America are asking for this type of food and it's not being given to them. So again, it's this sort of example of how the Mexican and Latino food worker is ignored and their needs are not being met at the same time that the food ways are becoming more available and becoming more embraced by the average American eater. And so this is definitely an example of the kind of contradiction that's setting up the dynamic for the rest of the 20th century. Next slide, or 2 slides forward. Moving to the civil rights era, so picking up on that 1960s period, moving into the 1970s, the book also traces how the Northeast changes our ideas or puts a twist on our ideas of civil rights era leaders like Cesar Chavez, who you see here in the picture on the right. And it changes our ideas of like what kind of civil rights movements were happening on behalf of Latinos when it came to the world of food that we might not know about. So when we think of Cesar Chavez, we think of California. When we think of the United Farm Workers Union that he led along with Dolores Huerta, we think of the West Coast, the Southwest a little bit, but we don't often think about the Northeast. And so what I wanted to do in chapter 2 of the book was show how the Northeast was actually really essential to Cesar Chavez's success when it came to organizing boycotts and strikes, when it came to farm workers and their rights in the United States or lack thereof. Because the Northeast was actually the region of the United States where some of the biggest fruit and vegetable markets existed. New York City, of course, was a big hub for moving food throughout the nation. Boston was another big one. Philadelphia was another big one. So it was really important to put on people's radars, and specifically through the 2 crops that Chavez led a boycott in against grapes and against lettuce. And maybe some of you remember these original boycotts and strikes. Lots of people were wearing pins and holding up signs that say, don't buy grapes, don't buy lettuce, don't eat grapes, don't go to grocery stores and get them, pick something else, but just boycott this commodity. To bring attention to the fact that farm workers, as you see here in the magazine cover on the right, child labor was a lot of what we could find in the fields, and we still find in the fields, quite honestly, and food processing factories in the United States. And not just child labor being an example of how labor rights were getting ignored and practices, were in violation of a lot of labor laws in the country, but that the average farm worker could not even afford the very food that they were helping to harvest in the United States. So Chavez, Huerta, and others who volunteered for the UFW union were trying to bring attention to, again, this irony. If farm workers themselves can't even afford to eat the very food they're helping us to eat, what kind of situation is that? And that's an extreme form of not only injustice in terms of labor, but also in terms of humanity, someone's human right to be able to access food that's both nutritious and enough. So a lot of farm workers continue to be really food insecure in the United States. So the Northeast became very important for Chavez to try to organize because it was essential that people knew in that region not to buy grapes and not to buy lettuce if they wanted to support the movement. And the Northeast was also full of these cities where a lot of wealthy donors could contribute to the farm worker movement. And so UFW activists, both men and women, were working really hard in the Northeast, setting up boycott campaigns and boycott offices, throwing fundraisers, holding events, holding concerts, holding dinner events where Mexican food would be served and everybody would pitch in a certain amount for a plate. All of these events were taking place because they wanted to attract people of all classes in the Northeast, but especially a wealthy donor class who could be able to keep financing the union's movement and goals. And so the Northeast has been understudied when it comes to Chavez and Huerta and the UFW. But Huerta spent a lot of time organizing in New York, actually. And Chavez came through the Northeast several times, touring around, gaining support. So chapter 2 of the book tries to show that when it comes to the civil rights era, we might think a lot of the activity is taking place in the Deep South and then in California, but we're overlooking a lot of these sites in the Northeast where a lot of exciting activity is going on and a lot of essential activity is going on. So in the civil rights era, people are fighting for the same things that guest workers were fighting for in earlier periods, still making the same statements about the inequality and irony of farm workers going hungry in the United States and being malnourished and suffering a lot of negative health outcomes simply by having to do the type of work that they did. And still, at the same time, that the 60s and the 70s and the 80s are passing by, we see Mexican food keep on taking off and Tex-Mex food taking off in popularity around the country. And so people are getting to enjoy a lot of the food and still needing to get more educated on food workers who happen to be heavily Mexican and heavily Latino. The next slide shows an example of a woman with some of the many women who volunteered for the United Farm Workers, for many decades. I think Chavez gets a lot of credit in the historical record for being a leader, but I think it's so important to emphasize the work and the volunteerism and the dedication and the strategic thinking of women. So this is a Latina woman boycotting in front of the New England Produce Center in Massachusetts, with a sign that says "There's blood on those grapes." That it's think about the ethics of buying grapes at a time where table grape and wine workers were not getting the types of wages and the types of health benefits and the types of care that they should have been receiving. So she and so many other women are a part of this story. And the Northeast is a region in which women really did take on big organizer roles and really moved the union's activity from California across the country. They uprooted their whole lives. They often brought their whole families with them, their kids, their spouses, their siblings. And not only were activists themselves, but inspired so many other women to follow the movement and become activists in their own right as well. Next slide. The last example I wanted to talk about, and this gives you an idea of chapters getting towards the end of the book, moving into the 1990s and early 2000s, is the case of Vermont. These are two pictures I took during my research visits to Vermont. On the left is sort of the typical idea we might have of Vermont in our imagination, like red barn, green grass, blue sky. It looks very pastoral, very bucolic. It's a nice escape. And I took that picture when I was running along a road, and it's indeed a quite beautiful place. If anybody's been to Vermont, if you haven't been yet, it does kind of feel very storybook like. And on the surface, everything seems clean and everything seems beautiful. But Vermont is actually a state that sort of hides in many ways how its image is propped up by Mexican and other Latino labor in the dairy industry specifically. So, Vermont is a state in the United States that's incredibly dependent on one commodity, dairy, or milk that's turned into various products. And so much of Vermont's economy is dependent on milk, but who are the workers tending to the cows, milking the cows, operating the machines, even serving as on the spot veterinarians for cows and their calves? It's Mexican workers, heavily Mexican and Central American workers. Lot more Mexican workers in the 90s. And as we've moved into the 21st century, Central American migrants have also joined the dairy labor force in greater numbers. So the picture on the right is a picture I took while touring a dairy barn. All the cows are facing with their udders towards the little alleyway created there in the middle. And the milking hookups are powered by machines that automatically hook up to the cow, milk them for a specific amount of time, and then fall back. But the machines can't do everything. So if you look in the far back of the photo, you see a worker spraying down the areas, and the workers have to make sure that everything is sanitized so no bacteria gets on the cows or in the milk. So it's a very delicate and strenuous and detail-oriented job to make sure that the dairy that gets into our yogurt, our ice cream, our cheese, the milk that we drink, on a daily basis, that all of that is safe and free from bacteria and free from the possibility of making us all sick on a mass level. So I learned a lot from researching the dairy industry and just how reliant Vermont is on what is heavily a migrant Latin American workforce. But again, one of the sort of confining and constraining elements in the lives of dairy workers is that because of their often undocumented status, they live right across the street from the dairy barns that they work for. So there's not a lot of separation between home and work. There's not a lot of privacy. There's not a lot of freedom or mobility to be able to live a life out in the open. And we have to think about the fact that Vermont, if you look at a map, it's quite almost all of it is within the 100-mile radius of increased Border Patrol surveillance. And so a lot of workers are very paranoid that if they step out too far from where they live, that patrol cars, local police, and immigration authorities will be watching and will be ready to apprehend them and deport them. And so this is really constraining a lot of people's choices in terms of their daily movements, and their decisions to be able to run errands on their own. None of them own cars. They have to get rides from their employer or maybe a friend who has a car elsewhere in Vermont. But in my research, I was finding that some of these dairy workers had self-reported not leaving their workplace for months, for 1 year, for 5 years. Someone had only gone to the doctor, as their only, public activity in 10 years. This is how scared people are of moving out and about, feeling like they might be very noticeable and apprehended right away in what is a very white, demographically white state. And especially with the increased xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric that is occurring in these states where the border is right there, they are feeling even more scared that they'll be at greater risk for being caught, even if they go try to buy something quick at the grocery store. So this is another way that people are kept food insecure, is if they feel paranoid or scared or hesitant to be able to go and feel free to shop for their own food, eat out somewhere, feel that freedom to kind of move about their community. Oftentimes, employers go to grocery stores for them and bring back food. Or the next slide, there are these services, or one more slide after that. Paqueterias. So paqueteros are people who can bring packages back and forth between who are often migrants and relatives who live in cities. So, like a lot of Vermont workers maybe had a relative in Queens, New York, who would send them Mexican sweets or candy or piñatas or masa, for tortillas or corn husks for tamales, like little packages that are measured by weight are sent back and forth to people. And paqueterias are one form of food provision that if a migrant feels too scared to ask their employer for things like specific Mexican ingredients or things that remind them of their culture, their home, relatives or friends elsewhere can shuttle food and ingredients to and from the migrants' homes across from the dairy barns. So this is actually a paqueteria service van that I took a picture of in my own neighborhood. Like we see them all the time. I live in Brooklyn right now, and we see these vans all the time in New York. And this is a definite food economy that has arisen out of the need of migrant workers who feel too scared to get certain things on their own or who might live very far away from a place where you could get these things on their own. And the previous slide is a quote from a female dairy worker, a Mexicana dairy worker who said, about Vermont, this countryside is really quite enchanting, but seeing the landscape no longer matters if we feel ourselves to be such prisoners and so shut in. And she was saying this in Spanish. The towns are very clean. Wherever you look, everything is in order. But it's as if they don't even want a single brown grain in the rice. And I think it's just such a great quote because these dairy workers feel like they're the brown grains in the rice. And that puts them at risk for being very conspicuous, visible in a way that they don't want to be visible. And at the same time, they do want their working conditions to be better. They're still not paid, enough of a living wage. They don't experience a privacy between work and home. Their shifts are double shifts often. Milking shifts are 12 hours apiece. So some people work around the clock, 24 hours, and then crash for a few hours to get sleep and then start it all over again. So all of this, what I hope the book makes us realize is, like I was saying at the beginning, the simplest thing that we might think of that we ingest on a daily basis or that we consider part of our routine, like the milk in our coffee, or the things that our kids eat in the cafeteria, or the hot dog we might eat at the stadium, or the fine dining experience if we go out to celebrate a big occasion in our lives. Like, all of these things only happen because of a huge workforce, and Latinos are a big part of that, and Mexican origin people are a huge part of that, of all immigration statuses. And so I wanted to conclude by just saying that I think we are a nation that still puts people in binaries. I think that when it comes to eating, the consumer gets to enjoy food. It's a pleasurable experience. It's not a political one. But for the food worker, they are often pressured, if you want something improved in your life, you have to be political. And I think it's very important for consumers to take on some of that burden of speaking out for workers, to become a little bit more political. I know that some people think, well, why do you want to intellectualize food? Can't it just stay a fun and pleasurable thing? And it can't if we really think about what it took to get that food to us. So if we can take a little bit of that burden off of people, to join them in articulating the need for better rights and more visibility in the nation, it would be so much better. And then on the flip side, food workers deserve to talk about food as a pleasurable thing for them. Like, they care about having it be enough for them and taste good for them and feed their nostalgia and be comfort food. And they deserve that just like anybody else. So I think we need to crisscross the responsibilities that we have to each other. And in this time, like I was saying, it's so important that we think about each other and that we think communally in these ways. Because if we stay very atomized and separate, not a lot of things are going to change. So when it comes to the world of food, I hope this talk, and if you check out the book, I, definitely appreciate it and let me know what you think. I hope it inspires people to talk more and to think more about how we can be more conscious eaters and more ethical eaters. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. I'm just going to close that window. Thank you so much. That, I think, was probably incredibly eye-opening for a number of our viewers. We do get viewers from around the country, including, we get a little pocket of viewers around the Washington, D.C. metro area,
Oh,
but the
awesome.
majority of our viewers are in the Southwest. So I
Yeah.
think that was really eye-opening. And I wanted to ask a little bit more, and certainly, folks, if you're watching and if you have a question, please go ahead and stick that in the chat and we'll try to get to it. But you mentioned at the top of the talk that people of various Latino groups have been in the Northeast for a long time, and certainly I think probably a lot of us think, oh yeah, sure, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans.
Yeah.
When did you start? When did we start seeing more numbers of Mexican descent people
Mhm.
in the Northeast?
That's such a good question, and one that I was curious about, and I was so glad when I started finding the answer. So it was around the 1930s that we started to see about like 500 when you looked at different cities. So like New York had in the census like 500 or so Mexicans moving there, a few hundred moving to Boston and then to Providence and then Hartford, Connecticut and other places. So if we're thinking about like numbers under 1,000, I would say it's the 1930s decade that we start to see that population increase to a critical mass that's getting paid attention to in government reports. And these people who were both, um, US born, but then also immigrant who had come to work in other industries in the US first. So maybe they were working in the meat packing industry in Chicago or the auto industry in Detroit, or the cotton fields of Texas or the sugar beets of Michigan, right? And then we're making their way out east to try to find some other work. So we had people coming from a lot of different experiences. Some were coming straight from Mexico via boat to East Coast cities, and that was happening as early as the 20s and the 30s. And when it comes to Mexican food, we start to see the very first restaurants in New York and in Boston. New York first with a couple of experimental pop-up restaurants, and then Boston a little bit later. But so, for instance, there was a Mexican restaurant in Times Square in the 1930s. And it
Mm.
was really cool to find evidence of the food sort of following the people and the entrepreneurs. I think a really important thing to acknowledge is like Mexican food is business history. Like that's the history of entrepreneurship in the United States is like making money off of what people thought was a very sort of humble cuisine and that people turned into all sorts of profit and creative enterprises everywhere in the nation. And so it's been about 100 years since we have witnessed sort of the beginnings of a critical mass of Mexicanos in the Northeast.
Yeah. Um, we do have a question from an audience member here. Awesome Platica. You mentioned workers having to politicize. Is there pushback to their organizing?
Definitely. Pushback definitely from employers and industries themselves. But there's also, I wouldn't quite call it pushback, but what does complicate a lot of these political struggles is that, and this has definitely been proven to be wrong, right? That all Latinos will act the exact same way and that they will all become political in the exact same way, just like any other group of people, that doesn't happen. So I feel what complicates labor struggles when it's come to the world of organizing in food labor is precisely the diversity of workers we find in the Northeastern cases. So this is Mexicanos, Tejanos, Puerto Ricans, Caribbean workers, Haitians, Jamaicans, Black workers from the South, Native American workers from Canada who come down for seasonal labor. Like the fact that these worker populations are so multifaceted, so multinational, multiracial, multilingual, I think some pushback can even come from within. So it's very hard to organize workers when there are so many angles of difference, and employers definitely like to play on that and pit workers against each other or separate them from each other. And when you throw in the precarity of somebody who doesn't have citizenship,
Hmm.
they are afraid to be political sometimes if it exposes them to possible apprehension and deportation. So
Hmm.
I definitely found examples, and I mentioned them in the book of um, that workers have the political consciousness, but sometimes it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of trial and error to actually get a victory of some sort, whether it's in wages or conditions, because it takes a very long time to accumulate a critical mass of people who are willing to put themselves at risk for being political in the ways that they are. And so I think it's totally understandable and valid. And as a historian, of course, we have to have empathy for the decisions of various groups of people. It's what we study. We study human decisions and human behavior. and the differences between people. And so I think Mexicanos and other groups of Latinos are not immune to those differences. So the pushback is both external, and I think sometimes it's internal as well.
Mm. You mentioned something earlier about Mexican food being associated with humble food.
Yeah,
And you're not wrong. And I think probably the same is true for Puerto Rican food and too, right? Comfort food almost, right?
right.
But I'm wondering these days we're starting to see more of these sort of high end Latino restaurants, including Mexican restaurants. Here in Texas, we recently had a Mexican run restaurant win a James Beard Award.
Yeah.
How is this sort of elevation of Latino food impacting workers, or is it?
Mhm. No, that's a great question, and this is a big thing I talk about in chapter 3, which I didn't get to talk about tonight, but, that's where I talk a lot about Mexican food and restaurants. I think what I'm the humility or the sort of humble nature of how a lot of people see Mexican food, I think at the same time that it can be charming and true, on the other hand, it can be very false because it devalues the ingredients and the difficulty and the labor and the creativity. Just like any other cuisine, Mexican cuisine is complex and it's diverse and it takes a lot of brain power and body power in order to make it happen. And so I think there's often this discourse that Mexican food should be cheaper than other food, or people sort of balk at the prices sometimes of Mexican food compared to European food or compared to other cuisines. So I actually think in the media and in the restaurant landscape, the fact that we're seeing more establishments of varying price points is actually a really good thing because it shows people that this is a cuisine that has all different sorts of presentations and all sorts of backstories and all sorts of complicated routes of getting the ingredients to the table. Um, and I think the equation of authenticity with cheapness is a really damaging one. And so when people think, oh, well, it's not the real thing because it's not just a couple of bucks for a taco. I hear that all the time in New York. Like, I'm not paying that much for Mexican food. Like, that's ridiculous. Like the chips and salsa should be free. The guacamole should be free. People still kind of say this kind of thing when they go out to eat. And Mexican food is seen as like the party food rather than the food that you sit down for, a fine dining experience. Those are fewer and further between. So I think it's so great that food media is getting more inclusive, that the awards given to establishments are now including more Mexican establishments, and that these chefs are getting featured and entrepreneurs are getting featured at all different price points. Because that is doing the work of sort of expanding people's minds about what Mexican food is. So I tackle the term authenticity in the book, and it's a complicated term because if we really think about it, what is authentic? If we look at the big scope of history, that has changed over time. So when people migrate, ingredients change. When technology advances, the way that people make a dish changes. So what was authentic a century ago is not necessarily what would be called authentic today. And
Mhm,
what was authentic in terms of Tex-Mex has changed a little bit. So
mhm,
authenticity is a complicated word anyway. And then when people think authentic and cheap together with Mexican cuisine, Chinese cuisine, other cuisines that are sort of stereotyped to be less inexpensive, I think
mhm.
people can get the wrong idea about how much we should be paying the workers, because then the cheapness of the food translates into thinking that the workers are cheap too.
Wow, good point. Um, we have another question. Do you have any thoughts on how we can best support the workers, especially now?
Well, I think now especially is the time to get acquainted with all the different legislators that you can write to, all the different nonprofit and advocacy organizations in your area or your state that you can start supporting. I think this is a time to just be ready to write a bunch of emails, make a bunch of phone calls, join information campaigns, and distribute that information yourself and talk about it with people in your networks. I think when it comes to the everyday practices of eating and shopping and making choices about the food that you eat, like if you go to a farmer's market, ask about the workers and not just the food. If you are talking with people about a restaurant or you visit a restaurant, um, examine the kitchen, meaning like look at the back of the house as well as the front of the house. Like, are you able to see the workers? Are they visible? Are they hidden? Who do they seem to be? Compliment the workers as well as the executive chef, right? Like, I think it takes more of these micro moments of showing awareness that we know that there's a long chain here of food provision. And I think showing consciousness of all the people it takes to get our food to us in everyday conversation and in little actions, those little actions all build up if more of us do them. So I think that getting food workers' rights in legislation has been decades long struggle. We still have a long way to go. Um, but a lot of people are saying right now, look inward or look local, look in your immediate sphere. And I think that's right, because if you become more mindful about your daily routine, you notice so much more that's happening in your world, from everything from getting your morning coffee or your morning breakfast burrito, to knowing what your kids are getting served at school lunch, to knowing like what you're going to have for dinner that night or what restaurant you're going to. So it's like all those moments of micro awareness that will add up to you feeling more conscious as an eater and you feeling more comfortable in reminding other people pay attention to that. I think our culture needs to have a shift when it comes to being more conscious of food labor instead of just thinking of it as something like over there, sort of hidden away. And it's something that's right in front of us if we pay attention.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Flores, for that enlightening conversation. And again, I really think you opened a lot of our eyes to thinking about the North, not only Mexican Americans and Latinos in the Northeast, but also the whole cycle of the
Mhm.
food and how people are impacted across that cycle. So thank you so much. Of course, I want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight. And I also want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Department of Arts and Culture, Bexar County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Charitable Foundation Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, Spurs Give, and individual donors like you. Gracias. If you like tonight's presentation, we have many more events coming up. You can always find our event calendar on our website right here, putting up on screen for you. You can find out more about MACRI and our upcoming events at somosmacri.org. Did you know we're working on building the nation's first Mexican American Civil Rights Museum? We are, and we need your support. Please visit our website to find out more, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and keep up with all things MACRI. So thank you again, Dr. Flores. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Check
Yes,
out
there's the book. We put a link to where you can find the book up in the chat too. So please support Dr. Flores and the wonderful work she's doing. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.